So last class, we discussed if statements and how we can build our programs using those. Today, we are going to be using another block of code called an else statement. So if we remember back to our program from last time, we had two if statements. We had our if age is greater than or equal to 18, and then we also had if age is less than 18. And we kind of discussed how it's not really possible for neither of these to happen because their conditions are exact opposites of each other. So if age is not greater than or equal to 18, it's always going to be less than 18. And if it was greater than or equal to 18, it's never going to be less than 18. So having this second if is kind of inefficient because it's impossible for neither of these if statements to run. So to solve this inefficiency, we can introduce the else statement. So when we write an else, it needs to follow an if. That should not say and, but hey, it needs to follow an if. The body of the else, so the code inside of its curly braces, is only going to run when the condition for the if that it is connected to was false. So when my if's condition is true, my code is going to run the stuff inside of the body. And when my condition is false, I'm going to run the stuff inside of the else. And I'm only ever going to run one of those two bodies of my program, or within each of those things. So notice there is no condition for the else. We don't need to say a condition here because its condition, when it's going to run, is when this condition is false. So we don't need to specify anything else for the else. We're just going to give it that body. And that's all we need to do. Does the structure make sense? Sweet. All right, so I can update my age example to say if age is greater than or equal to 18, system.out.println, congrats, you can vote. Else, system.out.println, sorry, can't vote. So now I'm still only going to run one of those two things. It's only possible for one of them to run, but I now don't have to check a second condition in order to run this second body. I'm just going to run it if this one was false. And if it wasn't false, I don't need to check anything else. I can just keep going in my program. So if we do an example, so the user entered 50. Is 50 greater than or equal to 18? It sure is. So we're going to run the code in our if. It's a very similar to how in other languages, yeah. So it's just a slightly different syntax because different languages have different structure. We will get into more complex things than we learned in the Python class for sure. So we're going to run the code inside of our if, and then our else is going to check, was the if condition false? It wasn't, so we're just going to skip the else. So our program is now over because that was the last line of our code. So if we remember back to our flow chart from last time, we had two diamonds, two decision points where we were choosing whether to diverge, whether to say vote or just skip, and then can't vote or skip. So we can simplify this. When I have an else, our flow chart is going to look more like this, we're going to take one of two paths. If it was true, we'll print you can vote. If it was false, we'll print you can't vote. And in either scenario, we're going to fall back into the program ending box. So this simplifies our flowchart significantly because we don't have as many decision points. All we have is this one diverging path. We're either going to go this way or we're going to go this way. And there we go. That flowchart make sense? All right. So for our example problem, let's say we have made a bill class that's going to help a restaurant write up checks. So we're going to have two instance variables. We're going to have the total cost of the meal, so just the sum of all of the customers' food, and we're going to have some number of customers. And we want to, this is going to calculate the user's check, how much money the people owe to the restaurant. So we've got our constructor filling in our instance variables. Now we want to write a method called add tip in that bill class that's going to add the tip to the total cost of the meal. So if we have 8 or more customers, the tip is going to be 25% on top of the cost of the meal. If there were less than 8 people, the tip should be 20% on top of the cost of the meal. And our method is not going to return a value. We're just going to update our meal cost variable. So what steps do I need to take in order to implement this method?
Use a if and else.
So we're
if it's more than or equal to 8, tip is 25%, else tip is 20.
Right, so if our number of customers is greater than or equal to 8, our tip is going to be 25%. Otherwise, our tip is going to be 20%. We also need to make sure we fill in the method's signature so that we can actually call this method. But that seems like a pretty decent plan of action. So we've got our create our method signature. We're going to check if there's 8 or more. If there are, add 25. If there aren't, add 20. So what's our method signature going to look like? First, we're going to have public. What return type is this method going to have? Back to this slide. What did we say our return value was going to be?
Double?
I mean, void, right?
Void.
It's going to be void because we're not going to return a value. So, public void, add tip. We don't need any parameters because we're just going to be working with our instance variables. And we can open our curly brace. So there we go. We have our first line. We need to check if there are 8 or more customers, and we kind of wrote that already. If our number of customers is greater than or equal to 8, then how can I add 25% to my meal cost? What kind of math should I do here?
Meal cost is equal to meal cost plus 0.25 times meal cost.
All right, so we can say meal cost, actually capital C, plus equals meal cost times 0.25. That seems legit. That seems good. We could also, instead of doing the multiplication here, we could just say meal cost times equals 1.25, right? We want to add 25% more. So we're essentially getting 125% of the total. So our meal cost, we're going to multiply by 1.25%, and then, or 1.25, not percent, just the number. Save that back into our meal cost. And then we can add the else. And what are we going to multiply for the else?
$1.2.
1.2. So if our number of customers was greater than or equal to 8, meal cost is 1.25. Otherwise, or multiply itself by 1.25. Otherwise, multiply itself by 1.2. And I realize I did not actually close my curly braces there. So this method would not actually work if you tried to copy and paste it. So if we look at the flowchart for this solution we just made, we've got our number of customers greater than or equal to 8. That's our decision point. If we have 8 or more, we're going to multiply our meal cost by 1.25. If we didn't, we're going to multiply it by 1.2. And in either scenario, after that, our method is going to end because that was the last line of code in our method. So there's nothing else that's going to happen afterward. Cool? Cool. All right, folks. That is our lesson.